Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fernando Galeana-Rodriguez, and I am an assistant professor of sociology and integrative conservation at William and Mary. Thank you for joining us today for this panel, where we will be discussing about the impacts of informal infrastructure on indigenous peoples and forests. By informal infrastructure, we mean those projects that are not formally sanctioned by the state. State officials might be involved in them, but it is really the non-state actors who are behind these operations and who often use extra-legal means to get this work done. This condition of illegality worsens the vulnerability of local communities and the environment. This is particularly worrisome at a time where we know that those forests that are under indigenous people's lands are one of the only hopes that we have to mitigate climate change. Today's panel will focus on informal road construction in the region of Mosquitia in eastern Honduras. Mosquitia is a region in Honduras with the least developed road infrastructure in the country. Since the 1970s, the government has discussed plans to open a road to connect the region with the rest of the country. Although a new road will definitely open access to services and market opportunities for the local population, the indigenous communities have rejected this proposal unless the state can guarantee the protection of their lands. The Mosquitia region is home to rich biological and cultural diversity. The Plátano River Biosphere Reserve, one of UNESCO's Natural World Heritage Sites, is located in this region. This region is also home to the Mosquito, Tahuaca, Pech, and Garifuna people. Since 2016, most of the area is now under the protection of indigenous territories that have been titled as well as protected areas. However, this legal protection hasn't stopped the expansion of the agrarian frontier, which in recent years has exacerbated by the rise of drug trafficking activity in the region. It is my pleasure to welcome to this event Dr. Erik Nielsen, Associate Professor at Northern Arizona University, Edgardo Benitez Maclin, President of the Institute for a Common Amerindian Future, and Dr. Jeremy Radachowsky, the Director of the Wildlife Conservation Society America program, who will be participating in this panel discussion, highlighting the various dimensions of this complicated conservation and human rights challenge. This event and this speaker series is brought to you by the Institute for Integrative Conservation, the Center for Racial and Social Justice, the American Indian Research Center, the Native Studies minor, the History Department, and the Anthropology Department. Thank you to all our collaborators for their support and partnership in this series. Before we begin, we wanted to acknowledge the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands that the William and Mary campus is on today. The Sharon-Hakanadaway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Madaponai, Monacan, Nansmon, Nadaway, Pamunkey, Padawomek, Upper Madaponai, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members, past and present. For this event, we will start by having each panelist provide background on the challenges, and then we will open the event so we can have a conversation about these challenges and those implications for indigenous rights across Honduras and in other regions. I will be translating for Edgardo, who is joining us from Honduras. All attendees' mics and videos will be turned off throughout this event. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. This event will be recorded, and we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording tomorrow. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to formally introduce today's panelists. Dr. Erik Nielsen is an Associate Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at Northern Arizona University. Erik has worked in the Mosquitia region for over 30 years, starting as a natural resource Peace Corps volunteer in the Rio Plátano Biosphere Reserve. Erik's current research focuses on governance processes and outcomes of community-based conservation and payment for ecosystem services, sociological dynamics of invasive species, traditional ecological knowledge and resource governance, and socio-ecological effects of narco-trafficking-related deforestation in Central America. Edgardo Benitez is a member of the Tahuaca Nation in Honduras. He's an environmental defender who has fought for the territorial rights of indigenous peoples in Mosquitia and Honduras for over 3 decades. He was president of He was president of the Tawaka Federation, and he has also served as a senior advisor to the Confederation of Indigenous Peoples in Honduras, COMPA, as well as to numerous initiatives and programs working on indigenous rights and environmental policy. He's currently the president of the Institute for a Common Amerindian Future, an organization that works for the promotion of human rights, sustainable development, and gender equity. Dr. Jeremy Radachowsky is the regional director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Mesoamerica, a Western Caribbean program. He has worked in Central America for 2 decades on issues ranging from ecological monitoring, conservation planning, adaptive management, environmental governance, and multi-stakeholder negotiation. His passion lies in tackling complex conservation issues, seeking practical and grounded actions to effect real impacts. Without further ado, we will begin with Erik's presentation, followed by Edgardo and then Jeremy's. Erik's slides will be in Spanish to facilitate the communication with Edgardo, but his presentation will be in English. Please, Erik.
Okay, thank you very much. While I'm sharing my screen with you, I'd just like to thank Fernando for the invitation and for the Institute of Integrative Conservation for assembling this panel of colleagues to try to share, I think, what is a pretty challenging situation. And so with that, if I can advance my slides, that's my one concern here. Let's see. Okay. We just changed the slide, I'm hoping.
Yes, it did.
Okay. So what I want to share with you is a result of research that we've been doing over the past 10 or 12 years with an interdisciplinary team looking throughout Central America and trying to understand how illicit activities are affecting sociocultural systems and the dynamics of deforestation in protected areas and indigenous lands throughout Central America. And the picture, the images here of a young child on the Rio Plátano and 2 people, one who's in jail in the United States, who's narco traffickers, and their presence and the effect that it has on indigenous communities. So the main problem that we see is a rapid increase in forest loss, and this is fundamentally driven. We've gone from a couple thousand hectares a year in the region of the Rio Plátano and the Tawaka Reserve back in the early 2000s to nearly 30,000 hectares per year in the last couple years. And the question is, what's driving this phenomena? And what we have observed and what we can see is that before the 2000s, there was always narco trafficking moving through this region, but at very low levels with very little impact on communities or on the environment. But as you can see from the figures, that by 2012, Eastern Honduras in particular had become basically a bullseye for movement of drugs to the United States, to markets in the United States, with some pretty severe effects then on what kind of infrastructure needs to support this economy, this very large illicit economy. And if you think about the drug trafficking routes through Central America, it's not just air infrastructure, it's coastal infrastructure and it's road infrastructure when we think about the multiple ways that these drugs move from South America to North American markets. And so when we saw this phenomena happening, we hypothesized that basically these narco capital, the infrastructure associated with this illicit activity would lead to faster, larger clearing of forest land. And that's what you see here that we've defined as anomalous deforestation. It's not like other deforestation because in fact it is bigger it is faster, and it's driven by narco capital. And you can see here on the right, along the Patuca River, this is sort of traditional subsistence agriculture of Mosquito and Tawaka peoples, which is a very sustainable system that creates actually intermediate disturbances within the forest that enhances biodiversity, versus the pattern that you see on the left, which are large patches, large clearings that cumulatively are negatively affecting biodiversity as well as access to forest resources for indigenous communities. And so the question is, how do we end up at a situation where very quickly we have massive forest loss, and our group and the evidence that we've collected using multiple sources is that it really is driven by organized crime and narco capital. And the actors are primarily not from the region, not even from Honduras in many cases, but Colombian, Mexican actors. And the indigenous peoples living in this part of Honduras did not invite, did not initiate these drug routes. They are a response to interdiction by US and Central American forces to try to slow the flow of drugs into North America. And so with the presence of these actors, they need infrastructure to be able to facilitate the ground transport, the air transport. They need to control land, whether it's in protected areas or indigenous lands, to facilitate that drug trafficking. And with narco capital accumulation, the need to launder that money and legitimize it within the Honduran economy. So those are sort of the three primary drivers and underlying drivers for what we see in terms of forest loss, territorial loss in Eastern Honduras. And that infrastructure has now opened up new avenues for colonization by third parties, colonists, and further land speculation in this region that historically has not had land speculation. One of our studies suggests that up to 60% of the deforestation in Eastern Honduras has been caused by narco capital. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the dynamic between not only roads, but roads and landing strips that are distributed across Eastern Honduras. And so as trafficking started, roads and indigenous community airstrips were used. And once those became target of law enforcement and surveillance, those landing strips moved. And as they moved and then were destroyed and moved again in response to anti-drug policy and interdiction and militarization, they moved farther and farther into the forest, and therefore needing roads to connect to these landing strips to then take those drugs through Honduras and to Central America. So these landing strips and the dynamic between interdiction and trafficking has provoked really a necessity for the construction of more illicit roads by these actors. And here's, we're going to talk, I think, primarily about this road number 4 here that connects Olancho to Gracias a Dios through 2 different protected areas, including the Tawaka territory. But also on the north side of the Rio Plátano, other roads that have been constructed to facilitate access to these landing strips. And I think the important thing to note here is just look at sort of the correlation. These are not all the roads in La Mosquitia by any stretch of the imagination, but these are major ones that we've identified. But you see the clustering of the red deforestation patches near these roads, which is similar to phenomena that we see in the Amazon with roads for agriculture and settlement. The road number 2 here on the north coast of the Rio Plátano Biosphere Reserve I just want to show, in 2013, the bulldozers arrived and started building these, again, no permits, no free prior informed consent by Indigenous peoples, not built by Indigenous peoples. And if you look at the image on the right, this is that same lagoon up on the top of the figure, but you can see an entire network of roads that are all constructed to facilitate both the transportation of drugs over land and out of this region, where there's lots of landing strips that you see on the right-hand side of the image. But more significantly really is what those light green patches mean. Those are all historic, traditional Mosquito hunting, swidden agriculture lands that Indigenous communities no longer have access to those lands anymore. They have been permanently displaced from those, utilizing their own forest resources. The second road I want to just show is the one here on the lower part of the image, road number 4, that has been called the narco carretera by the Honduran media. But that's only been very recently, even though the road has a very long history, which for about 15 years in the early 2000s was controlled by a cartel to facilitate movement from Nicaragua to the interior of Honduras. This was the completion of the road that got to Craucirpi. But if you look on it's a pretty terrible Google Earth map, but one of the important things that since that road has been finished, which is the red extent here getting to Craucirpi, there have been multiple branches off of that road that are both facilitating colonization and forest conversion to cattle pastures, both going, the green road going north, these blue roads going down to the Rio Patuca and near the Rio Wampu. And so these roads then beget other opportunities for land settlements in the region. And I'll just end with sort of, this is an image from 2017 of that same region of the Tawaka-Asagni Biosphere Reserve. Before the road was completed from the Rio Wampu, which is this river coming from the north, kind of straight south. The community of Craucirpi is over on the right-hand side. So in 2017, you see deforestation and colonization happening there. But by this year, you see the extent to which the forest loss has accelerated. And if you squint really hard, there's a whole network now of roads that have been bulldozed, multiple roads connecting to the Patuca River, not just the road that connected to Craucirpi. And this signifies, again, the loss of access to forest resources for forest people, accelerated colonization, and the loss of cultural practices when denied access to land. So I'll leave it at that, and I just want to thank the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center and the Open Society Foundations for funding a lot of this research.
Thank you very much, Eric. Edgardo, vamos a comenzar. And just to remind everyone that Edgardo will be giving remarks in Spanish and I'll be translating into English. Por favor, Edgardo.
Okay. Buenos días. Gracias por invitarnos a este importante evento y agradecer a Eric, a Jeremy y a Fernando por darle la importancia de esta actividad con relación al tema de la biosfera Río Plátano y la biosfera Tawaka en mi país, Honduras.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for this invitation to talk about these important issues in the biosphere, in the Río Plátano biosphere in Honduras.
El tema de las áreas protegidas y los territorios indígenas es un tema bastante complejo que hasta el día de hoy no se le ha encontrado una solución adecuada donde los pueblos indígenas realmente nos sintamos contentos de que se está solucionando los problemas de derecho reclamados de hace muchos años.
The topic of indigenous territories and protected areas is a very complex one that throughout the years, indigenous peoples have not found a satisfactory answer to how their rights should be recognized and respected on these lands.
Es una tarea pendiente y eso tiene que ver también entonces parte de la conducta de la gente local con relación a los problemas que tienen que ver con la carretera, con el narcotráfico y otro tipo de actividades ilegales en la región.
And that lack of clarity on indigenous land rights also has to do with some of the views that some of the actors have at the local level about that matter for how they conceive these lands and the potential construction of these roads like the ones that we're seeing.
El problema en Honduras que hemos llegado a esta situación es que hay un vacío de gobernanza institucional. Ese vacío ha conducido a que sucedan todos los problemas que hoy enfrentamos en el río Plátano y en la biosfera Tahuaca.
So the main problem that we're seeing is that there is a tremendous gap of institutional governance in Honduras, and this gap is what is contributing to these problems that we are experiencing in the region.
Las instituciones, casi en su mayoría, todos están bajo una política de manejar proyectos ilegales y promover la corrupción en los territorios.
So most of these institutions are following a policy that actually that encourages corruption and illegality in these lands. So that's really where the problem begins, at the very top.
Eso incluye autoridades civiles, desde secretarías hasta las fuerzas militares y policiales y fiscalías en el país.
This includes both the civil authorities, the military, the attorney's office.
Entonces, en este escenario de esta naturaleza, el tema que nos tiene hoy, el tema de la carretera, es un aspecto que se denunció de hace más de 20 años, que se venía aperturando cada año y las autoridades nunca tomaron ninguna acción con relación a eso.
So on this topic that is bringing us together today, it's something that has been happening for the last 20 years, where with each stretch of the road that was being built, the indigenous communities were denouncing it to the authorities who let this happen and continue.
Entre 1998 a 2000, recuerdo que hubo un proyecto financiado por la Unión Europea y había un presupuesto para que el CODEFOR en aquel tiempo, ahora ICF, el Instituto de Conservación Forestal, y las Fuerzas Armadas establecieran un centro de operaciones en Yapuás. Ese fue parte de la negociación con la Unión Europea y nunca se dio ese caso.
So between 1998 and 2000, there was a program funded by the European Union that was supposed to provide funding for the opening of an operation center in one of these entry points for the road that was supposed to provide for the surveillance by both the civil authorities and the military to stop these kinds of interventions, but that never took place.
Ahora nos damos cuenta de que una buena parte de la jerarquía de las Fuerzas Armadas están vinculados con actividades de narcotráfico. Tiene que ver con el tráfico de droga, tiene que ver con el tráfico ilegal de madera, tiene que ver con el tráfico ilegal de la pesca en la costa de la Mosquitia. O sea, ahora entonces tenemos claro el panorama de que por qué no estaban interesados en establecer un centro y buscar la legalidad de las acciones de las personas que estaban haciendo algo indebido en la región.
So 20 years later, it's a lot clearer for us now that one of the main reasons why the military was not interested in providing for these control points is because they themselves were participating in some of these networks, both for drug trafficking and for illegal timber extraction as well.
Y así entonces, ya del 2005, cuando toma fuerza la actividad del narcotráfico que conduce al golpe de Estado del 2009 en Honduras, entonces ya la fuerza que toma la ilegalidad es de una envergadura mayor en la región.
So what happens then is that after 2005, when the activities of the organized crime increased in Honduras, and then with the 2009 coup, where like it really exacerbated the whole problem. Like we see that these activities with such great force that it has become even harder and harder to stop.
Entonces, eso hace entonces de que las áreas protegidas declaradas legalmente, jurídicamente en el país, quedan en segundo plano, porque la que tome fuerza entonces en su momento la actividad ilegal en la región de la Mosquitia y tomando como zona de operación fuerte, donde la región de Aguas Vila, Huanquivila, sobre el río Pau, y saliendo por la ruta de Culmí. Entonces, esa es una región que logísticamente era necesario la apertura de una carretera clandestina que lo mantuvieron bajo candado un buen tiempo y los militares perfectamente sabían, porque el 5º Batallón de Infantería a la zona de Aguas Vila apenas lo separa alrededor de 25-30 kilómetros de distancia.
Mm-hmm. So what happens then is that the protection of these forests and communities in this area, they really become a second order concern. And one of the main aspects then that occurs, and as Edgardo mentioned, different points that are located on what could be considered the agrarian frontier that separates the Department of Gracias a Dios, where most of the Mosquitia is located, and the Department of Olancho, where some of these dynamics, are also happening with cattle ranching and becomes a site for these transport routes to go from the coast to the rest of the country and then to the border with Guatemala. So what happens then is that it becomes a priority, the construction of this road to be able to mobilize the increasing amount of product that was being moving through the region. And again, then with the protected areas becoming really very low in the priority for the state.
Entonces, como bien planteaba el doctor Erik Nielsen, ahí toma fuerza del 2005 hasta la fecha la actividad ilegal asociada con el narcotráfico y una ganadería que está asociada con la producción del cultivo de marihuana, que también tiene un mercado nacional y muy fuerte en el país. Y eso es lo que ha habido la deforestación y el acaparamiento de los territorios de las comunidades indígenas.
So as we saw in Dr. Nielsen's presentation, then we see that there is this phenomenon of narco cattle ranching that has been exploded since 2005. That is also that also has to do with the production of marijuana in some of these cattle ranches as well.
Denuncias ante la fiscalía hay muchos hechos por las comunidades, porque los pueblos, las organizaciones indígenas lo que hacen es denunciar ante las autoridades competentes. O sea, hasta ahí puedes llegar. De ahí para allá no puedes pasar la línea porque ya implica otros problemas. Entonces, las autoridades nunca tomaron ninguna acción con relación a los temas de la carretera en la región de la biosfera Tahuaca, como es en la biosfera Río Plátano.
So indigenous people have been making the announcement to the authorities, particularly to the attorney's office on several occasions, both for the Río Plátano Biosphere Reserve and the Tahuaca Sagni reserve, but that's really up to what the communities can do, because after that, really the legal action has to come from the state forces themselves to be able to provide the legal protection.
Okay. Ahora también hay que tener en cuenta una realidad. Es que la población indígena de la región creció. Ya no es 2,000 personas en el Patuca Medio, estamos hablando alrededor de 10,000 personas, porque no solamente hay indígenas, sino una buena cantidad de campesinos. Entonces, estamos hablando de una población que requiere, digamos, medios, cómo estar movilizándose con el interior del país.
So now we also have to take account of a different reality that is present in the territory, that we are no longer talking about 2,000 people in the middle section of the Patuca River, but now there is about 10,000 people, including both indigenous and non-indigenous, that have migrated to this region, who also need to have access to different resources, markets, education, hospitals, etc.
Entonces, esto hace de que la zona, las personas que en aquel momento, hace 20 años atrás, 15 años atrás, todavía la denuncia sobre el tema de la carretera, ahora nos encontramos de que hay personas que han llegado a Catacamas, a Culmí, a firmar y a solicitar la apertura de la carretera en nombre de la gente del Patuca Medio. O sea, hay documentos que dicen que solicitan que les abra la carretera.
So now what we're finding is that some of the people who 20 years ago may have opposed the construction of the road, now there is documentation showing that they have actually signed in support of a road for a new road to be built.
Entonces, pero todo esto se debe a la ilegalidad y a la falta de institucionalidad. Cuando hay un área protegida legalmente declarada y hay planes de manejo que se deben de echar digamos, a implementar de tal manera que se cumpla lo que se alcanza acuerdos previos con las comunidades, lo que no se está haciendo en este momento.
But like really what this boils down to is just the illegality and the lack of compliance that exists with the very management plans that have already been created for the protection of some of these areas that are not followed, and that those agreements that were established with the communities are also not respected. So this goes again to show the weakness that exists in institutional governance in the country.
Tanto en los diagnósticos de Río Plátano, diagnósticos, digamos, sociales, y tanto de la biosfera Tahuasca y los planes de manejo plantean la preocupación de la gente local sobre el tema de la carretera, lo cual no lo han podido detener porque las autoridades que deben de tomar decisiones al respecto no lo están haciendo.
Yeah, so the very documents that were prepared for the management of these areas, both in the Rio Plátano and the Tahuaca-Sagni Reserve, like they already express the point of view of the local communities about, like these kinds of road projects, but they're just not taken into account by the authorities.
No sé, Fernando, ¿cómo estamos con el tiempo? Me hace señal, pues decía para...
Si quieres una pequeña intervención más y ya pasamos a Jeremy, porque sí, estamos.
Ok, entonces creo que en este momento hay que analizar, digamos, la realidad de la región. Porque yo siempre he planteado que en la Mosquitia se hacen experimentos tan aislados, de que hay un proyecto en Sicopaulaya, hay un proyecto en Brus Laguna, hay un proyecto en la zona Tahuaca, no se está viendo la región como tal. Debe haber un plan integral de conservación de la región de la Mosquitia como tal, porque hay un montón de áreas protegidas, hay demasiada biodiversidad, estamos dispersos las comunidades indígenas y por tal razón debe ser visto en su totalidad como tal y no tanto proyectos aislados de una región a otra porque no nos está conduciendo a lo que como objetivo perseguimos los pueblos.
So what's been happening as well is that there is all these different isolated interventions and different programs to support different facets of natural resource management and environmental protection. But what is really needed is to have this comprehensive plan that can provide for a systematic way that some of these issues can be approached, that can connect different communities and that can really, look at the causes of deforestation and the encroachment of indigenous people's rights in this place and provide a comprehensive approach for their protection. Y ya estaríamos entonces, Edgardo.
Bueno, con eso quedo pendiente para ver si hay preguntas.
Excellent, yes. So please, Jeremy.
Great. Thank you very much, Fernando. I'd like to thank the IIC as well as the other panelists, Erik and Edgardo. Saludos from COP26. I'm actually in Glasgow at the moment at the climate negotiations, but it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to try to share a presentation with you. Are you able to see that now?
Yes, we are able to see it. Thank you.
Wonderful. So what I'd like to do is just very briefly give a little bit of background, as Erik has done somewhat at the regional level, and then try to share an example from Guatemala in a similar situation that I think can provide some input and guidance to potential ways forward in the case of Honduras. So these are Mesoamerica's 5 largest forests. All of these forests are under very intense threat, but as you can see, the northern 2 forests have lost 25% and 30% of their area respectively in the time between 2000 and 2015. And 2 of those forests are at risk of being cut in half, including the Mosquitia, as we're talking about. As Erik already mentioned, a large part of this deforestation is being driven directly by illegal cattle ranching. This is just a picture from Laguna del Tigre National Park in Guatemala, but it's very similar to the Mosquitia, to Patuca National Park, to some areas in Nicaragua as well. And as already been mentioned many times, this is often linked directly to drug trafficking and money laundering. Erik also mentioned this, but the pattern that we see is essentially that transshipment of drugs from South America is landing essentially in the Northern Triangle's least governed and wildest places, especially in the Mosquitia forest of Honduras and in the Maya forest of Guatemala. And again, this shifts over time. But interestingly, this is intimately tied to the issue of cattle and cattle contraband. So we also see a movement of cattle through Central America, northward, through to Mexico, which may or may not be tied to the legal beef export to the United States and to other places. And of course, as already been mentioned, in multiple places, this organized crime is causing all kinds of difficulties, including insecurity, violence, and of course, degradation of natural resources. And including the loss of many environmental defenders. In fact, Global Witness just put out a new report this year. These are the top 5 countries in terms of homicides or assassinations against environmental defenders per capita. And you can see that Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala are in the top 5 at the global level. So this is basically the place where these issues are coming together and where environmental defenders are at most risk. So what I'd like to do, though, is really focus a little bit upon, again, a similar case from Guatemala's Maya Biosphere Reserve that has been kind of pushing through these issues for the last 10 or 15 years, but where I think some breakthroughs have been made that, again, might provide a little bit of insight for some ways forward in Honduras. So this is an article from 2010, I believe, when, in fact, I think the term narco ranching or narco ganaderia first made headlines. This was when it was first coined. But you can see that in that time, the issues were becoming very serious. The same issues that we see in the Mosquitia were happening in the Maya Biosphere Reserve of Guatemala. Again, these are national headlines in the national newspaper. We did some studies at that point, basically This is an aerial survey of the Ruta Carmelita, essentially a road that leads through to some of the community forest concessions. This is one of the global models of community forestry that's held up around the world, where areas have essentially been concessioned out to communities to manage them over 25-year contract periods. But here you can essentially see our flight pattern trying to count and identify the cattle along this route. And we monitored this over time and found, again, this similar pattern of increasing incursion of both land speculation, but also an increase in cattle in the region. And here you can see just a correlation between the number of head of cattle in any given management unit and the deforestation. This is a perfect correlation. Essentially, you lose about 2.5 hectares per head of cattle, which again is an amazing amount of deforestation, amazingly inefficient use of land for productivity. And the pattern that we were seeing then is something I think that is similar to the Mosquitia now, where you've got large landholders, again, sometimes linked to organized crime, providing materials and resources to campesinos to cut down forests, often to burn those forests, sometimes to plant 1 or 2 years of annual cash crops. And then those large ranches would consolidate those areas into large ranches. And they would use those ranches essentially to, both to produce cattle, to gain money, but also to launder that money and for territorial control. An interesting thing is that, and then that cycle would begin again, often kind of leapfrogging into the landscape, sometimes into deeper and deeper into the forest. Interestingly though, when the authorities would crack down and enforce the law, often they would find the campesinos, those people who were being used as pawns essentially in this process. And rather than getting to the masterminds or the people who are behind these processes, it would essentially cause even more conflict again between campesinos and state actors. And again, these conflicts rose to the level where in Guatemala as well, we found, we unfortunately lost some people to violence. This is David Salguero from the concession of Cruce de la Corra, who was assassinated during that period. What I'd like to turn to though is some of the more positive actions that were taken to kind of turn the tide in Guatemala. So I think most importantly, a group of interested NGOs, academia, private sector, and government actors all joined together, very, very worried about the situation that they were seeing, in order, basically made the decision to really try to take back and revert this process of, ingobernabilidad, that it was called at the time. And through joint action, again, this is a multi-institutional, multi-organizational work, that group was essentially able to develop new control posts throughout the reserve in strategic areas, essentially to control the movement of cattle and all of the implements or supplies that are needed for cattle ranching. So heavy machinery, salt, barbed wire. So you can see here just some of those new control posts that were built, again, at very strategic points in terms of access. The number of patrols and kind of interinstitutional patrols was also increased between the Protected Areas Agency, the military, and NGOs, and even community patrollers. There was a big push as well in terms of basically the legal prosecution of some of these land invaders, including some people involved in organized crime. In fact, a few cases that were prosecuted to sentencing. Most were minor sentences, but at least with the absolute prohibition of these people from any protected area in the future, as well as some fines and a little bit of jail time. Interestingly as well, one of the very important things is at that time, there was support from the executive level, from the president of Guatemala himself. And he actually traveled to Petén, to Guatemala at that point, and made this statement. He essentially in English said, by September 15th, I've ordered the army to enter into Laguna del Tigre National Park. Goodbye to narcos and their cattle. I don't want to see one more head of cattle because I'm going to slaughter them and distribute them to the poor. And essentially at that time, they had what were called almuerzos solidarios, solidarity lunches. Alvaro Colom was a social democrat. But essentially, you know, it was a threat. It was essentially a warning to those people in Laguna del Tigre National Park. Interestingly, just with that statement, we saw the voluntary removal of between 10,000 and 17,000 head of cattle from Laguna del Tigre National Park. The illegal ranchers saw that their investment was at risk. They feared for the loss of their cattle, of their investment. And so without any investment by the state, and the government in fact was able to count those cattle to make that estimation because they had to cross a river at a certain point. So this is a fairly accurate estimation based upon the number of trucks and an estimation of the number of cattle per truck. But again, no investment by the state. What it took basically was that central level message from the president to give that message that your investment is at risk. There was no longer going to be complete impunity. And the good news is, again, this is a decades-long work, but over the last decade, again, this multi-institutional group has been able to recuperate or recover 155,000 hectares of forest within the Maya Biosphere Reserve that was being speculated or that had already been converted into cattle pasture. What we see today, or this is what it looked like in 2009. This is one specific area in La Colorada, one of the community concessions that had actually failed and been canceled at the time. I should have mentioned that 5 of the concessions were suspended or canceled. Again, this is one of the world's leading models of community forestry, but it could not compete with narco ranchers. So they were canceled. But this is what it looked like in 2009. 12 years later, this is what it looks like. That forest is recovering and recuperating. This is natural regeneration, but the forest does come back if law enforcement and control and protection activities are put into place. And the wildlife is coming back as well. Here you can see a Baird's tapir in that same area. More importantly, or just as importantly, there's kind of a renovation and a renewal now of community activity. And this is an example of some of the experimentation now with active reforestation and regeneration in some of the cattle pastures. Some cattle grasses are a little more difficult to remove and for natural forests to come back. So now there are active processes involving and employing local people in the reforestation. And just last month, the Guatemalan government announced essentially the extension of a few of those concession contracts, which were in question at the time or had been suspended. And in fact, gave out 2 new concessions to 2 new community organizations in this area that was basically in a similar situation to what we see in the Mosquitia at this time. So this is what we see as well in terms of deforestation or forest cover. You can see here in green, this is essentially forest cover gain, and in red is forest cover loss. In yellow or orange is essentially the net change over time. But you can see historically there had always been a net loss. It had always been lower than 0. And only recently has reforestation actually outstripped deforestation. For the first time ever, the Maya Biosphere Reserve is actually gaining forest again. So again, this is a little bit separate from the issues or from the experience in the Mosquitia. Guatemala is not Honduras. They're not completely the same, but in a similarly sometimes hopeless feeling situation, I think this kind of experience provides some hope, and again gives maybe a little bit of an indication of the path forward. But again, I think one of the most critical things with this was that this was an interinstitutional, intersectoral initiative that took the effort of a lot of people, and it actually took a decades-long work. So thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. It seems that Edgardo may have had experienced some connectivity issues. But let's continue the conversation. And just to remind our audience that they can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the panel to ask questions to our panelists, and I'm going to ask you the first question, and it has to do with something that Jeremy already alluded in his presentation. But what can the international community do to support the indigenous communities, such as the Tahuacan, the Miskito, and the Mosquitia, and what actions are already taking place to support these community plights? If we can start by you, Erik, and then Jeremy, and if Edgardo joins, I know that he also has some views about this.
I think one of the challenges and opportunities in Honduras, reflecting on Jeremy's experiences in the Petén, is that the governance of these newly titled indigenous lands, many of which are in protected areas, have not had near the level of direct investments that the international community and NGOs have invested in the community concessions in Guatemala. And so, the land was titled, which we think that's the first important step to recognize indigenous rights and give those rights, but a parallel effort to really strengthen the internal infrastructure of those indigenous organizations, their capacities, their technical capacity to monitor their own forests, to have indigenous territory forest guards working with the police, etc. That's been a real weakness in Honduras, but I think that there are opportunities to strengthen that and not rely entirely on state actors, which have not been very reliable partners to date.
Jeremy, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you, Fernando. And I actually have a couple of slides, if I can share my screen just once again,
Sure.
with some recommendations as well. Are you able to see that? I'm actually having a little trouble. Okay, here we go.
Yes, now we can see it.
Okay. Well, I think one thing, again, I'm a little bit adamant about this, but I think for me, cattle are sort of one of the intermediary here. Cattle is the reason, it's not the driver or the creator of the demand for drugs, clearly, but it is essentially the reason that there is so much need for land speculation and for conflict over land, which I think is really at the core both of the environmental destruction as well as the social conflict and the violence and insecurity. So again, this is a slogan, but I think it's really trying to think about how we can essentially tip the scales and the incentives for more trees and fewer cows. One thing, again, I mentioned the issue of cattle contraband and cattle movement through Central America. And so just a few suggestions. Much of that is going to informal markets, but some of that is actually going to formal markets as well. So one thing is basically to eat less beef, just don't add to the market. There are a number of zero deforestation commodity laws now that are actually forcing companies and forcing companies, if they want to access markets, to basically comply now with zero deforestation policies to show and demonstrate that they don't. And I think for the international community, essentially to pressure the companies. Sucarni is the major exporter of beef from Nicaragua as well as from Mexico. And again, we don't know, but there's a likelihood that there is some link between that and the cattle contraband issue. Secondly, there are policies that are not coherent at the moment between different ministries and agencies within government. So just some suggestions from the international community. There are a number of international commitments that Honduras has signed on to, including a climate commitment. Basically in the last day, in fact, they signed on to a zero deforestation by 2030 commitment. And of course, there are kind of the international commitments for indigenous rights, right? So basically push and ask or demand that Honduras comply with these as well. And then I think at the local and national level, again, harmonizing policies. Right now we have policies sometimes that are promoting exactly the activities that we should be looking to reduce. And, you know, both in terms of efficiency, but also effectiveness, I think harmonizing those policies is very important. But the most critical issue, of course, is corruption and intimidation. So again, I think just bringing attention to these issues in public fora like this one. So I'd like to thank you again, Fernando, for providing us the opportunity, but basically putting the pressure on governments through as many means as possible. And again, working together as a multi-sectoral alliance. These are very difficult issues to deal with. The more actors that are pushing in the same direction, the safer it is for everybody and the more possible it is as well. And then finally, again, as I mentioned in the case of Guatemala, the higher level messaging that can come out, I think this is very important. That taught us a good lesson that essentially sometimes you don't need to spend millions of dollars. What you need to do is kind of shift the perspective or the level of perceived risk of doing an activity. If you can basically change the idea that there is complete impunity, you can essentially change that risk-benefit analysis. And there's a lot of investment in cattle. So there's a lot to be lost. So again, just to summarize, you know, I think that speculation in land invasion is really the driver of most of these things. It's important to recognize that it's not the road that's driving this. The road is a symptom of these other issues. And then secondly, just again, there is hope, there is a way forward. It is possible to revert these trends, but what it takes is political will, and that needs to be engendered. And then finally, again, you know, maintaining the importance of this issue, pressuring private companies as well as governments to eliminate illegal livestock in protected areas as well as indigenous territories. I would say, again, these are kind of the major lines that I think the international community could push along.
Thank you very much to Erik and to Jeremy for providing us these very concrete steps that we can take and we can continue to support. I see that Edgardo is back and we're also reaching the end of the seminar. So I'm going to give Edgardo the last word. Edgardo, bienvenido nuevamente. Ya estamos casi por completar, pero si quisieras ofrecer unas últimas palabras, sobre todo en este tema sobre soluciones, nada más te pido si la intervención puede ser corta, porque ya estamos ya casi por terminar el seminario.
Sí, gracias. Bueno, hablar de soluciones ante problemas tan complejos que nos enfrentamos en la región es difícil. Pero sí creo que hay que empezar a trabajar en empoderar más a las comunidades indígenas, a sus organizaciones de consejos territoriales. Creo que hay algunas figuras dentro de las comunidades que no están tomando posiciones fuertes como deben de ser, como ser las mujeres y la juventud indígena. Y también trabajar con los campesinos, o sea, hay gente campesina que realmente asumen conciencia y compromiso, pero lamentablemente la llegada de, digamos, gente vinculada con la ilegalidad, como el tema de narcotráfico, como el tráfico de madera ilegal, tráfico de flora y fauna, eso hace de alguna manera de que la misma pobreza en que nos encontramos las comunidades vulnerables, como nos llaman ahora, entonces hace de que seamos presa de ser cooptados por este sistema tan corrupto y digamos tan criminal que de alguna manera nos hace copartícipes pues, del negocio. Creo que entonces hay que empezar a pensar en cómo empoderar y trabajar más directamente con las comunidades que estamos afectados. Gracias.
So it's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but Edgardo is addressing that one of the most important ways that we can support communities is by strengthening the empowerment of these organizations, of these local councils, and particularly also by focusing on those populations that maybe have not been taken enough into consideration, such as as the role that women and youth can play in these territorial councils, and also to take into account those non-Indigenous peasant communities who also have an interest in conservation, but because of different levels of poverty and vulnerability, they have also been co-opted into these different illegal networks for the trafficking of drugs, timber, flora and fauna. So really, if we take it into account that we need to put our resources to support these communities and their empowerment and raise voices within these councils as well, then that can be one of the ways that that something can be done from this from the grassroots level. So with this, we have reached the end of our panel. I want to thank again Erik, Jeremy, and Edgardo for excellent presentations. It was very clear the different connections that the three of you made to the political economy of the situation, to how it compares to the situation in northern Guatemala, and giving us some concrete steps also about what can be done. So here at the Institute for Institutional Conservation, for Integrated Conservation and William and Mary, will be taking over some of these recommendations and they will give us a lot to think about like where to go next. So thank you again also for all the people who joined us for this seminar, and please stay tuned for future seminars as part of the Indigenous Speaker Series. Thank you very much.